So, welcome everyone to this DCED webinar. Let me just say who I am. My name is Mike Albu and I'm the director of the Beam Exchange. I'm part of the DCED Secretariat. I work with about half a dozen colleagues in the Secretariat, and this is a DCED webinar. So while we're waiting, I'll tell you a little bit about the background to this webinar. So over the last couple of years, actually, the Business Environment Working Group and the Market Systems Development Working Group of DCED have both been kind of really interested in this topic of economic transformation, and we commissioned a couple of different studies which will be talked about later. We have the two lead authors of those two studies here in the room. They're going to be speaking to you, and this webinar is really to present the findings, but in particular to look at the way that the market systems development work and the business enabling environment work kind of work together and to promote economic transformation. So we're really interested in the crossover between these two fields. So I hope if you identify yourself with a sort of market systems approach, or if you identify yourself with a business environment reform kind of approach, you'll be open to hearing what people from the other side of the fence think about this joint objective that we all share. Here we have our 5 exciting speakers today. So Dirk Willem de Velde from ODI, one of the authors of one of the reports, and Matt Ripley from Impact Management, the author of the other report. They're our main speakers. And then we've got 3 members of the DCED representing Gatsby Africa, Sida and ILO. So Arjun Bhoopal is an active member of the Market Systems Development Working Group. Kåre Johard is a leading thinker in the Business Enabling Environment Reform Group. And Eriksson Skoog is currently seconded to ILO. She's been a very active member of the Market Systems Development Working Group. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give Dirk and Matt most of the time to talk about the reports, and Arjun is going to talk about some kind of try and put the practice of, or the theory of economic transformation into a real kind of real world context, give you some examples. Then we'll get some comments from Kåre and Gun as well, and all of that will take about 35 to 40 minutes. And at the end of that period, we'll hand over to you guys to ask questions, which is why the Q&A box is so important. So just for those of you who joined the room in the last couple of minutes, if you look down the bottom, you'll see a Q&A button. You click on that, you get the chance to ask a question, which I will moderate, and I'll look through the questions and try and pick out the ones which we've got, which are most interesting or most pertinent, and we'll cover them in the final 20 minutes of the webinar. So hopefully we'll squeeze a lot in. Okay, it's 1:05. I promised we'd start on time to the speakers because I know they're eager to tell you or give you their views. So I'm going to hand over to the first speaker, who's Dirk Willem de Velde. Dirk.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Mike, and also to the DCED more generally to asking us to write this report, but also now to provide a presentation on economic transformation in particular. And we've divided tasks that I will be talking mainly about what is economic transformation, what do we think it is. It's probably fair to say that economic transformation means different things to different people. But our briefing, which you can download from the DCED website, discusses 2 core components that are central to the literature of economic transformation, which tell us about the definition of economic transformation. First of all, economic transformation is about structural transformation, which is about moving factors of production, such as labor or capital, between sectors. For example, a shift towards sectors with a higher productivity. This is about moving low productivity agriculture, and you can see it on the slide now, moving from low productivity agriculture to higher productivity manufacturing or high quality services. But there's a second component that is also really important about economic transformation. And this is really sector transformation, which is about productivity increases within a sector, from one firm to another, or within firms. So in short, economic transformation is about doing things differently. It is about increasing productivity, and it's not about doing more of the same. For example, exporting more and more oil or raw materials without adding any value to it. And our research shows quite clearly that when it comes to low-income countries, there are very large opportunities for economic transformation. And this is because there are very large productivity differentials between sectors, between firms within the sector, and between production lines within the firm. So this means that if you shift resources from one type of activity to another, you could increase productivity quite dramatically. And hence, of course, economic transformation. Now, economic transformation is absolutely crucial for sustainable development and poverty reduction. And this is so for at least 3 reasons. First of all, economic transformation and productivity growth is central to getting higher income levels and to create more productive support jobs. So this is really at the supply side of economic transformation. Secondly, economic transformation is crucial for accessing more efficiently produced food, housing, transport, and financial services. So that's more on the demand side, really. And thirdly, economic transformation really helps us to create a more diversified economy that is more resilient to shocks. And of course, we see that now, that this lack of diversification in a range of countries presents those with a high degree of vulnerability. Countries that are now overly concentrated on a particular export market, they're now shut down. Or perhaps that are concentrated in a particular commodity that is now subject to very low demand and declining market prices, world prices. So economic transformation is crucial for sustainable development, for poverty reduction. But unfortunately, we haven't really seen much transformation of that kind in low-income countries. Of course, there are notable exceptions, and Bangladesh has created a vibrant manufacturing sector. Ethiopia is trying to do it now. But on the whole, we haven't seen that much transformation. There has been growth in many countries, in many poor countries, including in African countries, since the late 90s. Quite a decent growth rate. But production structures have remained broadly similar. So growth hasn't been really transformative. Growth wasn't really job intensive or sufficiently poverty reducing. And economies are still dependent on exporting commodities, whether it's oil or copper. And they're now suffering even more from COVID. But growth wasn't really sufficient inclusive either. And just to give you a country example, if you compare Ghana with, for example, Korea, and you compare its progress since the 60s, in the 1960s, both of these countries had the same level of income. Since then, one country has transformed, and the other has transformed much less. One country has made stellar progress on poverty reduction within a generation, and the other much less. And of course, Korea has been a stellar example of the traditional type of transformation, really going from agriculture, manufacturing to services, and Ghana much less so. And now what we see is that the average incomes of the bottom 40% in the Korean economy are actually higher than the average income of the top 20% in Ghana. Now, this is not to say that Ghana may follow the same pattern of Korea, and of course, the future of African transformation will look different. But it is to sort of to say that transformation is absolutely central to raising incomes. And if we then finalize our discussion about what economic transformation is, it is also good to say that there are different patterns of economic transformation, and there may be trade-offs between what's happening in the short and in the long run. We need to ensure that economic transformation is inclusive, and it may not always be there in the short run. And a particular pattern may not be that conducive in the short run, but maybe in the long run it is. How do we ensure that economic transformation is more inclusive? Well, for example, by fostering better linkages between formal and informal sectors, by creating jobs in sectors that employ or have externalities for the poorest, and by emphasizing efficient production of goods and services that are consumed by the poorest directly. Economic transformation is a long-term issue. It's a long-term process. It may not immediately benefit the poor, but it's really the only way to support poverty reduction in the longer run. It is necessary for sustained inclusive growth, and without economic transformation, there will not be sustained progress on sustainable development goals. And this has been emphasized over and over again by African leaders. They have done it for so many years. So this is basically about the definition of economic transformation. And now I'd like to hand back to Mike to progress with the rest of the seminar.
Well, many thanks, Dirk. That's a very helpful introduction and really framed the topic. So I want to try and put that into practice, into some kind of context. Arjun, just quickly, what does that mean in practice? What would it mean to support economic transformation in a development program?
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, we at Gatsby focus on a sector transformation. And to us, this is really about creating a step change in scale, creating large scale impact, not incremental change. And the way we look at this is looking to build competitive, inclusive, and resilient sectors. So that's how we sort of break down sector transformation. And for us, resilience is really important. I think as COVID has highlighted, there's a real need for sectors to be able to withstand shocks, to maintain growth, and to keep innovating. So this is the sort of framework for how we at Gatsby look at sector transformation. And when we've selected a sector to work in, the first step for us is to really develop an ambitious, compelling sector vision, a picture of what a competitive, inclusive, and resilient sector might look like. And then we build a program strategy, specific areas of work that can drive that change, and then specific intervention or activities that can support that program strategy. So this again is sort of the route we take as we develop our sector programs. Now I'll try and bring this to life a little bit by talking about how we've developed our sector vision for our aquaculture program in East Africa. So before 2015, the aquaculture sector in East Africa was an underperforming sector. It had low productivity, low production volumes, and low levels of competitiveness. However, the sector had huge promise and potential. East Africa has superb freshwater resources. There's a growing supply-demand gap in the region. And there was a small but committed private sector. And we felt that with the right support, the sector could grow 10 times by 2030. And East Africa could be a global leader of aquaculture with an inclusive industry supporting over 100,000 jobs. So there was this huge promise that we felt was sort of unrealized. And the question is, why hadn't this happened already? And to a large extent, there were a lot of donor programs that were focused on unsustainable smallholder models and weren't really looking at addressing the fundamental drivers of competitiveness. And so the sector never really had a chance to take off. I'd like to talk a little bit about how you might set a vision for growth and how there are different growth pathways you can take. And here's the example of forestry in two countries, Chile and Vietnam. It's often useful to learn from how other countries have built and developed their sectors. As you can see from the graph here, both Chile and Vietnam have seen transformative growth in their forestry sectors over the past 10, 20 years. And both countries have developed really competitive industries supporting hundreds of thousands of livelihoods. However, they took very different growth paths. Chile has a sector that's dominated by two large firms, while Vietnam has a smallholder-led sector, which is much more inclusive. And so as sector programs, we can make conscious choices about the industry structure we want to develop and how to best balance competitiveness and inclusiveness. Dirk talked about the difference between within sector transformation and structural transformation. While we as Gatsby work specifically in sectors, donors can take a portfolio approach and contribute to structural shifts in the economy. So for example, the way you build your sector can include a mix of industries where the poor are employed today, as well as some early stage nascent industries or industries of the future. And so you can start to shift the economy. And taking a portfolio approach also lets you balance risk and short versus long-term impact. And I think it's useful for donors as they're developing their portfolios to think about what their risk appetite is and whether they're willing to go into early stage sectors, test them out and see which ones are likely to succeed. So thank you, Mike. That was a really quick sort of overview of how Gatsby approaches some of the concepts that Dirk mentioned. Back to you, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much for putting Dirk's sort of theory into a real life context. That helps me understand what it means. So I'm going to turn to Matt now, because Matt, one of the authors of the report, I'm really interested, or we're interested in, and the focus of this webinar really is on the relationship between the market systems development approach and the business environment reform approach as two approaches that work to hopefully work in a complementary way to promote economic transformation. So can you tell us a bit about that, Matt, and particularly about the briefing that you wrote for us?
Thanks, Mike. And yes, so let me first start by clarifying what precisely we mean by business environment reform and market systems development, and then go on to explain how they can potentially come together to support economic transformation. So as you see in this slide, the business environment we can define as the complex of policy, legal, institutional, and regulatory conditions that govern business activities. And BER, business environment reform, in turn involves changes to these conditions with the aim to reduce the costs and increase the risks. Reduce the costs and the risks of business activity. So you see on the level of targeting we have here in this diagram is the BER activities have often been designed to affect the whole economy, so at the macro level, although more recently there has been this interest and growing interest in targeted BER around sectors and subsectors at the meso level. Market systems development, in turn, is an approach to poverty reduction that seeks to achieve lasting and large-scale change. And the aim is really to address the root causes of constraints to improving the performance and position of disadvantaged groups. And MSD has a more of a flexible targeting. It can zoom in and zoom out at different micro, meso, and macro levels as needed. It often starts with quite a specific focus on target groups, but can zoom out and end up identifying a whole range of constraints and issues to inclusive growth that can often, in fact, relate to the business environment itself. So if we move to the next slide, we can see how BER and MSD can actually be harnessed to better supporting inclusive economic transformation and how they could potentially come together. This is a simplified theory of change to show how they can complement both within sector and structural transformation processes that Dirk Willem was talking about. Simply put, market system development could be used as the organizing framework through which to diagnose, analyze, and act on constraints to economic transformation. When we were doing the interviews for the report, as one donor said to us, the market systems development approach can be instrumental to promote the concept of a mixed economy where public and private sectors can work together in a sustainable way with a view to achieving economic transformation. But more than organizing approach, we need the right activities, and BER in particular can help get the right enabling environment in place to raise innovation and investment, and along with complementary other activities, particularly around things like infrastructure, these will be crucial for the success of economic transformation. And if we move to the next slide, we can see, in fact, in order to contribute to an economic agenda in practice, we think that both market system development and business environment reform are incredibly well positioned, but there are some tweaks and adaptations potentially to how we actually apply both approaches in practice. And three main areas. The first is the importance of what we call smart targeting. So ensuring efforts are geared towards supporting the most transformative sectors and highest productivity potential opportunities within sectors. Not an easy thing to do, and picking winners is notoriously difficult, but nonetheless a very important part of economic transformation, particularly for structural change. And as Arjun was talking about there, a portfolio approach can go a long way to spreading the risks of it being difficult in hindsight to figure out what are going to be the modern sectors of the future. Market system development already has a very strong sector selection process. And one of the things that we felt needed to be done was perhaps take a look at that again with an economic transformation lens and see whether the criteria that are used are actually allowing us to pick sectors that have opportunity for generating bigger impact over much longer time horizons. So the central challenge is focusing on sectors that will be important to generate jobs, incomes, and livelihoods in the future, as Dirk Willem was saying, but that's not necessarily the same as those sectors too important for jobs, incomes, and livelihoods now in the immediate and short and even medium term. Second potential set of adaptations in practice was actually how different intervention approaches can come together, because the literature is very clear that successful economic transformation, when it takes place, requires different enablers to come together, like infrastructure, inputs, investment, tax, regulation, finance. It all kind of needs to work. So interventions in markets need to be interdependent and mutually reinforcing. So here it was felt that market system development and business environment reform need to broaden collaboration both together but also across other disciplines, including into areas such as governance. And there needs to be a strong complementarity of actions that we take as development projects with national development policies, and particularly industrial policy priorities. And finally, we need the right conditions in place to be able to make a meaningful contribution to economic transformation. And so this means ideally longer time horizons or long time periods for projects, realistic expectations of how long it takes to actually generate measurable impact. And as Arjun was saying, a higher risk appetite, because some emerging sectors and some businesses in these sectors may have much higher failure rates than the sectors that we know are important now. And it also may mean that programs might need to get more hands-on. So particularly market system development has placed a strong emphasis on a facilitation role, more of a hands-off role to intervening in sectors. So how can that facilitation role be maintained whilst considering that some of these new sectors, these more modern sectors, and the emergence of them might require harder tactics like investment alongside softer technical assistance and programs. And then finally, it really means that programs need to be willing to sometimes to get stuck into the complicated business of the political economy. We think both obviously MSD and BER are fully equipped to do that, so it's more a matter of actually the will and the appetite to take on political economy constraints head on rather than working around them, because actually those political economy constraints may be actually the ones standing in the way of successful economic transformation processes. Thanks, Mike. Back to you.
Well, thank you, Matt. That was very concise and clear. So what I'd like to do actually is go back to you, Arjun, now, and see, can you just put that into context again and give us a couple of concrete examples? This is market system development and business environment reform actually working together in a sector program. You have an example, I think.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think to do this, I'd like to go back to the aquaculture example I'd shared earlier, and I talked about the ambitious vision we have for the sector. Now, in terms of thinking about how to get there, we have a roadmap, a program strategy, which first focuses on improving competitiveness, then on really scaling growth in the sector, and lastly on building resilience. And to do this, in the first phase, for example, we tackle the real constraints to competitiveness, such as feed, and we'd support a pioneer fish farm to give a boost to innovation and growth in the sector. In the second phase, we might look at mobilizing large volumes of finance and tackling environmental risk, which could potentially, if not addressed, cause the sector to collapse. And lastly, in the third sector, we'd look to build resilience, strengthening sector associations, building government commitment and coordination across East Africa. So as you can see, this is quite a comprehensive strategy which uses elements as Matt has presented in the previous session at the micro, meso, and macro levels, and it borrows heavily from both MSD approaches and BER approaches. So in a sense, tackling the need, the sector transformation need from both top down and bottom up. And another way we look to do this is not just looking at constraints holding the sector back, but also looking at where the opportunity for growth and innovation are that can really drive competitiveness and then cause and create a globally or regionally competitive industry for East Africa. And so, so I think this is a sort of a very brief overview, obviously, of a complicated sector strategy, but I hope it gives sort of an overview of how MSD and BER are both used to drive this. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about something else Matt brought up, which is the need to understand political economy and to engage with government if you want to undertake a sector transformation agenda. This is ambitious and needs the support of government. And to do this, you need to understand the political economy context. So who the players are, what the power dynamics are, formal and informal relationships. And one tool we use at Gatsby is a stakeholder mapping. And here's an example of one that we did for one of our programs. And we try and identify through the dark green dots individuals who can be champions for the change, and equally individuals in the network here identified in red who potentially would be opposed to the change. And this then helps you with your strategy and tactics, when and how to intervene. So what does this look like in practice? Here's an example from our forestry program. We had an objective to work with government on the national forestry policy so that it would incorporate components of commercial forestry and open up dialogues on concessions. And so to achieve this end objective, we first had to build our credibility, evidence, and our positioning in the sector. And the way we did this was by setting up and leading Tanzania's most comprehensive tea improvement research program. We then brought in government and private sector into the initiative. And through this work and the value we demonstrated to the sector and our key coordination role, we were then invited by the government to co-chair the newly set up forestry working group, which then allowed us to work closely with government and advise them on national forestry policy. Now, as you would imagine, working on political economy and engaging with the government isn't easy. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And we've learned a lot through trying different approaches. And one of our key takeaways is that it's extremely useful to have credible senior local staff on your program teams who can engage with senior government and private sector leaders and influence them. And equally in developing not just formal relationships, but informal relationships. And I think a crucial sort of lesson for us is that there's a need to be patient and to be responsive and to wait for the right opportunities. For example, when there's a change in leadership of a critical government agency, or when a crisis in the sector opens the government to the possibility of new policy recommendations. Matt also talked about the need to be flexible in the tools and approaches you can use for sector transformation. And then this has been our experience as well. There are a range of tools from more facilitative, like sharing evidence, convening and brokering, to more direct, like investing, placing staff in partner organizations, and designing and implementing solutions. And you might want to take the more direct approaches in thin markets, for example, or when you're operating in early stage nascent industries where you may need to buy down risk or prove models or break supply demand deadlocks. For example, you might want to build the market, and this might mean, for example, importing improved seeds while you're developing a longer-term tree improvement programs. It might involve developing new technical solutions for the industry, or it might involve catalyzing investment by putting investment into a pioneer firm and then looking to crowd in commercial investment. I think it's important, though, to consider sustainability when you're thinking about which approach to use. In general, more facilitative approaches are preferred unless there's a good strategic reason to have a more direct approach. Thank you, Mike. I think that was just wanted to give a flavor of some of our work and how we approach sector transformation. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you. And you did that very well, I thought. Very clear, very interesting. So I'm going to, just before we go to the Q&A session, I want to give a chance for Kåre and Gun, who are the members of the DCED work, the two DCED working groups that commissioned this work, to reflect on what we've just heard. So the question really for both of you is what issues do you think this raises for us within the DCED and the wider development community about how we bring together market systems development approach and BER work? And I'll start, Kåre, with you as the task team member from the business environment reform group within the DCED.
Thank you very much, Mike. I hope you can all hear me. It's been
yes, we can.
Really fascinating listening to these interventions. As Mike mentioned, me and Gun were part of the kind of original task team that initiated the couple of technical reports under the DCED and also this briefing note from the beginning, because we really felt a need to move the agenda forward a little bit with regard to economic transformation. There's been a lot of research, as I'm sure many of you know, on this topic over the past few years, but really not that much in terms of concrete guidance and support for development actors and agencies on how to practically support this really worthy objective. So I'll mention a couple of points that I think were especially pertinent from my perspective, from the business environment perspective, and also from Sida as a donor, if you will, and then Gun will add a few points. Firstly, I think the reports and the interventions so far have really illustrated how business environment reform and our kind of traditional way of doing things can really benefit from integrating a kind of market systems development approach from a few different for a few different reasons. So one is that I think traditionally, kind of looking back at the title of the webinar, there's been a bit of a focus on top-down interventions and looking very much at the legalistic kind of picture of what seems to be constraining economies as a whole. But I think we can really go a long way by changing that mindset a little bit, by having more of a bottom-up approach and by really looking at firms' real constraints on the ground, look at things like enterprise service and so on. to really identify what are the key bottlenecks. And also, I think in that same vein, that a more targeted approach or smart targeting, as I think Matt referred to, might often be warranted. So that might mean targeted in the sense of just strictly prioritizing more. What are the key actions for really stimulating transformative sectors? But also thinking more concretely of which business environment reform actions are the best, and where's the best evidence base for stimulating new and catalytic investments in transformative sectors. So also in both MSD and business environment reform programs, I think there's a lot remaining to be done in many agencies to really look more closely at stimulating new sectors, where the sectors that might be able to create jobs in the future, so to speak. And then secondly, I think what's been really important for us at Sida for taking these issues onwards is to have a bit more of a concrete sequencing, because it's with this huge and sometimes abstract topic, it's hard to know how to really go about it. But firstly, it's my view, and what we've tried to do here is that to really get a kind of common understanding at the agency level, get people involved on the topic of economic transformation, and see how your agency is relevant in that landscape and what your entry points might be. So for Sida, for example, we of course have a very explicit poverty reduction mandate. So the issue of inclusive economic transformation with decent jobs and so on is really crucial for us. Also, we work in around 35 countries. Obviously, they're very different in terms of their transformation potential in the short and long run and so on. So really analyze which countries might have the most political willingness, engagement on that level, and also potential on the short and long run, of course. Then moving to the country level, an obvious point is that you need to start with the analysis. The MSD approach, as has been shown here, can really help and go a long way in just kind of helping you gathering the stakeholders, getting them to kind of talk about the constraints and the bottlenecks, and identify the root causes of those bottlenecks. Then the reports also mention quite a few interesting kind of technical and specific sector identification methodologies that can go a long way in identifying where a particular economy is now, which sectors and subsectors they're involved in, and where one might be able to go from there, so to speak. Obviously, coming from that, you need to really agree on those key bottlenecks and prioritize among them, and prioritize actions around those bottlenecks, and obviously be open for change along the way and to really iterate, because you can't really set out a trajectory from the outset that's likely to hold in detail. Finally, it's just hugely important for us to kind of review and shape portfolios around the kind of transformation objectives. So that very often means getting complementary interventions that Arjun talked about, having the portfolio overview or the portfolio view on the short and long term and so on. And for me, what's particularly interesting has been constructive is to combine instruments of different kinds. So that means, for example, having traditional interventions around regulatory reform, technical assistance, and capacity building and so on, but really to combine those types of interventions with more of innovative financing, private sector engagement, and for Sida, quite a bit of the use of the guarantee instrument to really stimulate a lot of investment in kind of transformative sectors with job creation potential. So that type of combination seems quite constructive very often to us. So just to conclude, I think obviously it's always very context specific and everything, and so you can't really recommend which actions work better than others. But the briefing note really comes a long way in kind of helping you around a kind of methodology for identifying those actions, I think. Back to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, and thanks for pointing out again that, in a sense, the central point for this whole webinar is this briefing note that's been published by DCED with practical guidance and some pointers to where we think this should all be going. And that briefing note and the two really detailed reports that preceded it are available on the DCED website and also on the Beam Exchange website. If you search for promoting economic transformation, you'll find all of those documents there. So final word before we go to Q&A for you, Gun, as the other representative from the task team that really created this output.
Yes, thanks a lot, and thanks colleagues for all your presentations and inputs. There's a lot to say, but I will try to focus on a few issues I wanted to highlight in particular. One or a few on economic transformation as such, and also on the market systems development approach and its usefulness. To me, I have really realized during COVID that economic transformation is rendered all the more important by this crisis, in particular because the crisis shows to us the need to build resilient economies, not least through what has been mentioned, diversification of economies and sectors and of trade and supply chains, but also resilience through increased productivity growth, value addition, more inclusive and sustainable growth. At the same time, the crisis creates opportunities for more transformative change. Like most crises, there is a window of opportunity now for more radical reform. For example, to speed digitalization, which is already ongoing, and that could mean for economic transformation that we promote sectors, digital service sectors, for example, which in turn can help to transform the growth and development of other sectors. It also creates opportunities for building back better. I mean, not going back to business as usual, but something new, whatever we want to promote there. And I think green and environmentally sustainable economies is one of those areas that we would or could become better at. When it comes to the market systems development approach, it provides, as mentioned, an organizing framework, but it also offers very much of an approach. It's a systemic approach, and as such, it acknowledges the complexity of social change. And economic transformation is a huge, complex, long-term process of economic and social change. And that complexity creates uncertainty, how to go about what is right, a lot of coordination, interaction. You cannot plan know that in advance. You need to have much more of a gradual, organic approach, you could say, where you test measures, you learn by doing, you revise if needed. Actually, you do that continuously. And the market systems development approach, it provides a systematic way to do that. It uses adaptive management to flexibly adapt to new knowledge, to changes, to learnings as you go along. So it's very well suited. But I also think that the MSD approach, as it is being applied, could be complemented in additional ways than some of those mentioned earlier or in the studies. I think that it would be really valuable to focus even more on support for the growth and development of enterprises. And the reason is that it is within enterprises that productivity growth takes place through scale, through specialization. So that is not to be forgotten. And then I also think that for more transformative change within sectors, whether particularly established ones, but also new ones, it's very important to consider the relationships within the value chain, between actors along the value chain. More particularly, to consider degrees of competition, degrees of market power and organization, because they will determine bargaining power between actors in the chain and how the returns emerging or developing within that chain are being distributed. And for example, between in the traditional sector, smallholder farmers and buyers. This is really crucial. It's not emphasized sufficiently in my mind. And this circumstance, I mean, if we focus on these issues, this issue in particular, it highlights the role of political economy, of course, and vested economic interests, which are behind much of this. So that makes it tricky, but necessary. And then it was, of course, has huge implications for inclusiveness of this process and for competitiveness also. Yeah, so I think there's a potential for MSD, for business environment reform. It probably needs to be complemented by additional measures and using approaches and tools. But there's something to build on here, that if we combine that and develop that, I think we could get even farther than we are doing at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, good. That's great. So look, we are not doing too badly for time. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions and answers. In fact, Dirk's been very productive, and while the others have been talking, he's been answering some of the questions already in the Q&A chat box, which is very good of him. But I want to actually, Dirk, if you don't mind, because some of the questions are very interesting, I want to take you back to that first question that you answered from Roman Troxler. What opportunities do you see for structural transformation in Africa? Structural transformation, that is. Do you mind speaking to that? Although I know you've given a written answer there, but I think everyone would like to hear what you say.
Sure. I mean, I think it is sufficient transformation in African countries, but there are always opportunities, and there are a range of opportunities that spring to my mind. One is, for example, around the potential for regional growth, and some regions are still growing, not as fast as one would hope now, but there may be potential. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Area may spur some more regional integration, and so there's one opportunity there. The second is, as Gunn was already mentioning, was around digital economy and digital technologies, which have the opportunity also to perhaps leapfrog to some extent if other things, basic things are in order, like electricity provision and basic infrastructure is still very important. But it is the opportunity, and that needs to be addressed in a targeted way. And perhaps there are also clusters that could be spring up around cheap provision of energy, in particular renewable energy. And there are certain parts, particularly in African countries, where this is a possibility. And of course, also in addition, as the question already raised, was there still the potential also for low wages as well. But this is perhaps some countries, not all countries. So I'm thinking particularly at the moment that garment wages in Ethiopia are low and have a competitive advantage, but of course over time they also need to increase and raise productivity and the quality of jobs, and wage should go up as well. But all these are opportunities, and these opportunities, if you miss them, you get a greater divide with the richer countries. So it does need hard work over a sustained period of time. It needs appropriate policy. So yes, business environment reform, but much more than that as well. And that's what I think what I found so encouraging from interventions from Arjun and Gunn and Kåre and Matt as well, is that what is really important here is the political economy. It's leadership. It's you learn, you experiment, and by doing that you can seize opportunities. So the opportunities are there, but it needs active engagement, not passively sitting back and not taking those opportunities.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question that follows on from that, actually. And I'm going to throw this one at you, Arjun. It came from Jerry McCarthy in the registration process, and it's really addressing exactly what Dirk was just saying. Is our business and environment reform and market system development approaches sufficient? I mean, as the tools that we need for promoting economic transformation, especially, and let's put it in the context of the current situation where we're facing such a lot of shocks around cope from the COVID pandemic. What do you think we should be learning from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the COVID, the impact of COVID has been sort of devastating. I think it's hit at the economy level, at the sector level, at the value chain level, and at the household level. So in some sense, it's almost impossible to expect sectors to be resilient against this onslaught. But I think it gives us really useful lessons going forward. And I think in terms of MSD and BER, I think what they do is give you a good framework to come at this from the bottom up by looking at household value chains and top down in terms of looking at what policies, what sector governance, what public-private dialogues are needed to help the sector as a whole respond. And I think we've seen in East Africa that some sectors have been much better at responding because they've been better organized. So they could very quickly identify what support was needed to help the sector survive the crisis, and were able to have, and there were existing mechanisms to have dialogue with government, to let government know what was needed. And I think those are the sorts of sort of thinking and approaches we need coming out of this, to look at resilience at all these levels. And I think MSD and BER may not be sufficient, but they could, I think, as good as two approaches to help you look at this from different angles. But yeah, thank you. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So Matt, let's put you on the spot now. James Foster has asked a really interesting question. He says, is the challenge with the MSD approach and with donor funding in general is the lack of breadth in the top level impact targets. You know, we're looking at jobs and incomes that can lead to the focus on jobs and incomes risks leading to a very limited focus thinking about these bigger sort of structural issues we're talking about, long-term productivity gains, competitiveness, and so on. So I guess could you speak to that issue, that challenge?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a really important question related to how on earth do we actually even kind of monitor and evaluate a program in the context of a bigger picture economic transformation objective. We cover it in quite a lot of detail in the full report on market systems development and economic transformation. I know Dirk, Willem, and ODI have done a lot of work on this before in the past, but I think, James, you know, what I'd say is yes, I'd agree. I think what came out of the interviews and the work we did for the report was that if there is a too strong a focus on a narrow range of outcomes, particularly around poverty reduction for a specific target group, then it's going to limit a program's ability to focus on those more underlying drivers of change that could ultimately actually be more transformative and meaningful in the long term. I think that's particularly compounded by the current evidence kind of paradigm where, you know, programs often need to kind of show quantifiable progress and impact, sometimes linked to even payment on the poor in terms of incomes, jobs, and livelihoods within a given program time period. At the same time, there was an interesting sense from other donors that goals, you know, on incomes were not actually ambitious enough. The programs were aiming for kind of 10%, 20% increase in incomes, whereas actually in some contexts it's like a 200% increase in net incomes only going to bring someone towards kind of middle income status and away from the vulnerability of sliding back into poverty. But to tackle those kind of bigger picture changes, clearly we're going back to the time horizons. These are things that only will play out over long-term 10-year plus change processes. Someone's called economic transformation a nation building initiative. And I think we have to be realistic that projects can only contribute to those much larger change processes that are ongoing and kind of influence the pace, the direction, the depth of change. But I think we need to be realistic about, you know, how much impact can be claimed and at what level. So one of the things that also came out quite strongly was there's a need for agreement on what are kind of the intermediate outcomes, what are the signposts of change that we're on the right track and things are moving in the right direction. And that might not be to do with the top level of the typical things that are measured, but could be more qualitative measures, more participatory, even related to kind of the structure of markets, the type of competition that Arjun was talking about, different types of innovation. So how can we get creative on kind of measuring proxies and signposts, not just focusing on a narrow top layer? So yeah, really important question.
Okay, thank you. Good. Well, at the risk of opening things up at this stage of the day, we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, but there's a couple of people who've asked questions about what it means to move from low productivity agriculture to, you know, sector transformation agriculture. What does that mean for food production, food security, jobs in that sector. So Richard Tinsley asked this question, 109, but also we have a participant from Bangladesh who's kind of asked the same question about what the reflecting on what the impact of agrarian change has been in Bangladesh, where a lot of he says a lot of people became lost their jobs in the agriculture sector as the sector has transformed. So yes, maybe Dirk, any thoughts on Richard's question, for example, the way he's framed it, which is what happens to agriculture when sector transformation takes place? What are the implications to food security?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. But I think first of all to say that in the definition of economic transformation, we do think that it's really important to both move between sectors, but also increase productivity within a sector. So of course, increased productivity within agriculture is really important. I suppose there's a difference between sort of pushing labor out of agriculture because agriculture becomes more productive, or pulling labor out of agriculture because you have created jobs elsewhere in the economy. What is important overall is that economic transformation goes hand in hand with labor moving out of agriculture. So share of labor in agriculture is going down, and Willem and Roderick have done a really excellent work in this. But of course, it shouldn't be done before you have reached a certain level of productivity in agriculture. And I think that's in African countries in particular, many low-income countries, the productivity of agriculture is so low compared to the other sectors. And that isn't the case actually in developed countries. So in developed countries, actually, you do have agricultural productivity almost at the same level as some of the productivity in other sectors. It's just the gap is so huge in the poorer countries. So there's huge potential still for agricultural productivity change in poorer countries. And that can also help to create, to address food security. Production alone isn't enough for food security. Incomes are much better to address food security, which can be both by agricultural production, but also by creating high quality jobs in manufacturing and high quality services as well. And that can then in the end pull in high quality jobs. So at the end of the day, it is a bit of both. So you need to do high productivity growth in agriculture, and you need to create jobs in high productivity activities. So you need to do both. So I think that's a really good question.
Great. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much. That's an interesting way to end this webinar. We've run out of time. We'll probably talk a lot more. It's been very fascinating, interesting hearing you talk. But I want to draw everyone's attention just to the chat box, if you've managed to find the chat box, because you'll find, first of all, you'll find links to these reports in there, and we'd be very keen, particularly look at the policy brief, because it's only 3 or 4 pages, 5 pages, I think, is that Matt? We can, you know, you see, it's not a big read, and most of these points are summed up in that. But the other thing I wanted to just ask you, if you've enjoyed today, if you found it valuable, could you please click on the link to the quick survey at the final chat box entry at the moment, 158. There's a little link there, taking you to a little 30-second survey. Give us a bit of feedback on what you thought about today's webinar and how we could improve it. We'd find that very valuable. Okay. Otherwise, we've run out of time. I want to just say a huge thanks again to Dirk, Willem, Arjun, Matt, Kåre, and Gun. Thank you for speaking so clearly, so punctually, so engagingly. It's been very interesting listening to you all, and thank you to all the people who turned up to listen. Please share the link for the webinar recording. We'll send it to you so you can share it with your colleagues and get them to listen to it afterwards, or listen to it all again. You never know. You might find you take it even more the second time. But please do share the link, and we will and fill in the survey and come back next time for a webinar on the DCED or indeed on the Beam Exchange. It's been our pleasure. So have a great day. Thank you, everyone.